surprise shone light from distant northern skies. At that point, I realized I don't know where it comes from, but I know it's okay. This is all an illusion, and I'm willing to play.
Welcome to the Quantum Guide Show, interviews with awakened masters as they share their quantum work with you. The Quantum Guide Show is produced by Karen Holton, creator of the 9 Steps to Quantum Health Transformation, a free 9-step online course to give you the tips and resources you need to thrive. Karen lost and continues to keep off 178 pounds of surplus body weight as she made her dreams come true. Whether you are awakening to the ascension process or simply want a wiser, more efficient lifestyle, this program is for you. No strings attached. The Quantum Guide Show is brought to you in part by Zendome's Orgonite, Karen's unique brand of orgone generators, ethically sourced, handmade, and double charged for maximum effect. Find out how orgone generators work and what they can do for you. Don't be fooled by imitations. Check out Karen's current selection, only available from her website, KarenHoltonHealthCoach.com, and on Facebook, facebook.com/Quantum Health Transformation. Enjoy the show.
Welcome back to the Quantum Guide Show. Today in episode 60, I'm very happy to introduce you to my returning guest and friend, Preston Dennett. And we're going to talk about 2 of Preston's books called WONDROUS, 25 True UFO Encounters, and also UFOs at the Drive-In. But before we talk about these 2 amazing books, here's a little bit of background information in case you're not familiar with Preston Dennett. Preston began investigating UFOs and the paranormal in 1986 when he discovered that his family, friends, and co-workers were having dramatic, unexplained encounters. Since then, he has interviewed hundreds of witnesses and investigated a wide variety of paranormal phenomena. Preston is a field investigator for the Mutual UFO Network, also known as MUFON. He's a ghost hunter, a paranormal researcher, and the author of 28 books and more than 100 articles on UFOs and the paranormal. Several of his books have been Amazon UFO bestsellers. His articles have appeared in numerous magazines, including Fate, Atlantis Rising, MUFON UFO Journal, Nexus, Paranormal Magazine, UFO Magazine, Phenomena Magazine, Mysteries Magazine, Ufologist, and others. His writing has been translated into several different languages, including German, French, Portuguese, Russian, and Icelandic. Preston has appeared on numerous radio and television programs, including Midnight in the Desert with Art Bell, Coast to Coast, and also the History Channel's Deep Sea UFOs and UFO Hunters. His research has been presented in the LA Times, the LA Daily News, the Dallas Morning News, and other newspapers. He has taught classes on various paranormal subjects, and he lectures across the United States. Preston currently resides in Southern California, and I encourage you to check out his website, www.prestondennett.weebly.com. Check out the links in the description because I've got a list of Preston's books that he's published so far and other contact information. So Preston, thank you so much for joining us today. And how you doing?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me on the show. I always enjoy speaking with you, Karen.
Oh, thanks, Preston. Me too. It It's just so fascinating. You've got so much information and you've done so much research. But I was thinking today, why don't we start off with a little bit about how you got started in all of this?
Yeah, as you were reading my resume, I'm like, wow, freaks me out a little bit because I've been in this field for so long. It was just nothing that I would have ever expected to happen to me in some ways, but in other ways, I feel like it was almost destined. Because at a very young age, I knew I was going to be a writer. I just knew it. And I didn't know what form it would take, but I knew it was going to be, amazing, profound stories. I wanted to be a writer. And I knew there would be something more to it than just writing. And well, here we are. And quite shocking, really, because I was very into science, very into, analyzing the world and anthropology and philosophy and astronomy and biology. I thought, wow, here we have true knowledge. This is, can figure out this universe. This is really cool. And then I got pushed into the twilight zone, totally unexpectedly. I mean, like thrown into the deep end. And I remember it vividly. Really, it began on November 17, 1986. And I think people who are familiar with my research have probably heard this story before. So I'll try and add some new elements here and there. But it was a spotted sighting over Alaska by Captain Kenju Toroshi. And he came on the news and described how he was in his commercial airliner, he and his crew, and were confronted by two very large walnut-shaped craft in front of them, twice as large as their jet, so huge. And it was on radar. They could see it. They requested a course change to try and shake this thing because it was following them. And that was granted. They changed their course, which is a big deal, when you're flying. And it still followed them. And so a great case. But I will always remember the way this was treated on that news segment, which lasted about a minute. And they said, hey, look, this pilot, he thinks he saw a UFO. Oh, really? Have you ever seen a UFO, Jane? No, I haven't. And that was basically it.
Mm-hmm.
But they showed a picture of this pilot. But that poor deluded man, why did he do this? He's obviously seeing a reflection off the ice cap. UFOs can't be real. I would have heard of it by now. That it would be taught in schools. The stars are too far away. There's just no way. But it would not leave my mind. And I remembered my brother Mark, my older brother. I've got, three older brothers, an older sister and a younger sister. And he said he'd seen a UFO year earlier, like 5-7 years earlier. And so I asked him next time I saw him, I'm like, Mark, I was 19 years old at the time. Well, let me think. No, I was 21. Sorry. My mom had died 2 years earlier, so I couldn't ask her. But I ended up asking everyone in my family, but Mark was the only one who'd seen a UFO in terms of direct blood relatives. He's like, yeah, I saw him. I told you. I'm like, well, tell me again, because I didn't believe him before. And he described an incredible sighting. Metallic disc, colored lights, a dome on top, totally silent, treetop level. And he chased it in his car with his two friends for 15 minutes, kind of played cat and mouse with them. And at one point, he was quite close to this thing, he and his friends. Talked to his friends, they gave the same story. And here's a part of the story I don't normally add. But at some point, I'm not sure how long it was after this, my sister-in-law was sitting next to Mark, kind of holding his arm, petting his arm. And she's like, what's this? What's this in your arm? And she sort of could palpate this object in his arm. And it was about the size of a half matchstick, maybe, a tiny little half-inch cylinder type thing. And they showed it to me. They're like, what do you think this is? I'm like, oh my God, where did you get that? He's like, I have no idea. I mean, I just found it, and there's no entry wound. There's nothing. So I ended up taking him to a doctor who's also a UFO researcher. He's like, oh my God. And he diagnosed his foreign body. We didn't go and get x-rays or get it removed or anything like that. But I'm wondering if this was more than a sighting, because it turns out my sister-in-law, his wife, was visited by blue beings when she was a little girl. And she did not tell me this at first, because I was asking everybody, and finally she became comfortable enough, like, well, I did have this experience when I was a little girl.
Mm-hmm.
And described, how over 2 weeks she was visited by these short blue beings, who I've heard described by many other people since. But, I started asking everybody I knew. And what a shock to find out that, my other sister-in-law, not Christy, but my other sister-in-law, married to my other brother, also had a UFO sighting with 2 friends over Van Nuys Air Force Reserve Base, and later admitted to seeing grays outside of her home. So that was a huge shock. Found out family friend Sylvia Walters, pilot, flight instructor, had a very close-up sighting of an egg-shaped object with her friend, not far from our home in Topanga Canyon. Found out my sister's friend Mark, not same name as my brother, but a different Mark, had also seen a UFO. And as he described it to me, I ended up interviewing all these people. He had a friend with him as well. Took me quite some time to realize he probably had missing time.
Mm-hmm.
I did not realize that at first. But at one point he's describing the UFO in one position, suddenly it's in another. They're very frightened. It was zooming towards them. Next thing they know, it's zooming away. Brought it up at work. I worked with 20 people or so. And the lady whose desk was next to mine said, yes, me and my whole family saw UFOs. And I'm like, you're kidding. And she said, no, it's a star-like object. We were up in the San Bernardino Mountains. It was darting around for over an hour. We watched it. I'm like, are you sure it wasn't a helicopter? And she says, Preston, it was darting across the sky. Zoom, zoom, zoom. Stopping. Totally silent. I just went on from there. I'm like, can I talk to your daughter? Because she would come in and I kind of knew her a little bit. And she confirmed it. And she also was visited by grays. So I'm like, oh my God, what is going on here? This cannot be happening. And in walks Dorothy, who I'd worked with for years. And anyone who meets Dorothy loves her because she's just so outgoing and funny and no filters, right? Just brutally honest. And says, oh, UFOs? I saw one. I'm like, oh no, Dorothy, what? She's like, yeah. I was a kid, I was with my friend Carol at the Pio Pico Library. My mom was coming to pick us up. She comes and picks us up when the library closes at 9:00. So we went out at about 5 minutes to 9 to smoke a cigarette so she wouldn't catch us. And they're sitting there on the steps of the Pio Pico Library in Koreatown here in Southern California. Crowded area, by the way. And there had been this star-like object up in the sky. And Carol noticed it first when they went into the library. She pointed it out hours earlier. Like, what's that? Look at that. That looks weird. And Dorothy's like, that's a star. And Carol's like, I don't know. That looks bright. Is it flashing? And so they went inside and come out hours later and it's still there. And suddenly it drops down in a split second and it's across the street, right over the telephone wires. Classic saucer. Yeah.
Wow.
Incredible. And Dorothy gave a very vivid description, like colored lights, classic saucer, silver, silent. And I ended up interviewing Carol, her friend too, and her mom, Dorothy's mom, who came to pick them up. Like, mom, look, flying saucer. It's funny because I interviewed Dorothy's mom, whose name was also Dorothy Senior. And she says, I don't believe in UFOs. I'm like, oh, okay. What did you see? She says, well, it's saucer shaped. And it was right across the street. It was, not very high. It was totally silent, had colored lights on it, but I don't believe in UFOs. I'm like, okay, just tell me what you saw. She says, well, we got in the car and it followed us home. And the girls were freaking out. And I was a little nervous. And I didn't want to look up. But she says the girls were looking up and saying, it's following us, Mom, it's following us. Which they both said, it was. So they get home. She says, Preston, we live 5 minutes from the library, very close to it. We ran inside, ran upstairs, looked out the window, and this flying saucer was hovering next to the window, or, kind of over the front yard there. And at treetop level, pretty low, 50, 100 feet. It darts across the yard, back, forth, and takes off at a right angle up into the sky, up into outer space, becomes a star-like object, and it's gone. And Carol looks at the clock. Carol or Dorothy, I can't quite remember which one, but one of them looks at the clock. So, my God, look, it's 10:15. Where did the time go? And Dorothy, none of them had ever heard of missing time. And I had, because I had just started picking up books at this point. And I had Bud Hopkins' book, Missing Time, which was a hardback at that time. It was published by Richard Merrick Publishers, not by Ballantine, which later picked it up and made it a bestseller. So it was a virtually unknown book at this time. And I'm like, Dorothy, do you know what missing time means? She's like, what are you talking about? I'm like, missing time, where did the hour go? What do you think happened? She says, I don't know. I have no idea. I'm like, I think you may have parts of this experience you don't remember.
Mm-hmm.
She's like, what are you saying? I'm saying maybe it was more than just a sighting, Dorothy. Like, what do you mean? Like, maybe you were inside of it. And she got all pale. I was like, oh my God, you're kidding. I'm like, no. People are going under hypnosis to recall. And she's like, I'm not doing that. So this is how it started for me. It hit home. And I was not happy. I was very unhappy.
Mm-hmm.
This was thrilling, very interesting. But when I started checking out books, they said they were real. And the evidence for it was compelling.
Mm-hmm.
And it shook me to the core of my being, because Earth was being invaded by aliens and no one was talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
And not only was no one talking about it, there was a cover-up. And it was obvious, demonstrable, proven. So that was really hard to take. And another really difficult aspect was people were describing being levitated, pulled through walls, telepathy, and various paranormal aspects to this. That was like a big pill to swallow. So I was out of my mind for a year with this.
Wow. Yeah, that would shake up your paradigm for sure. And then the fact that it's not being acknowledged or talked about, I don't know, and I can't speak for you, but in my own case, it's kind of like I doubted my own sanity for a while there, because if it was true, then wouldn't more people know about it? That kind of thing, right?
Yeah. And I was telling my dad, here, UFOs are real. He's like, don't talk about UFOs. I'm like, but they're real. Here, read this book. What was it? Clear Intent by Barry Greenwood and Lawrence Fawcett, about UFOs hovering over Air Force bases. He would not read it.
Mm-mm.
I'm like, Jamie, UFOs are real. My older brother, Steven, they're like, shut up. Stop talking about UFOs. Poor Preston, he's gone off the deep end. I'm like, Victoria, what do you think about UFOs? She's like, oh, I believe in them. Don't you remember they were in the encyclopedia when we were kids? Like, no, I don't remember that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, Valerie, my little sister, what do you think? She's like, probably they're real. But they didn't seem at all interested in it. And the people who had seen them, my brother, my sister-in-laws, my friends, people at work, I'm like, why didn't you tell me? And they said, you wouldn't have believed me, would you? And I'm like, well, yeah, I guess you're right. But I was mad at them. I really was. I was mad because they should have talked about it.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't have been in this position of feeling so betrayed and scandalized and upset.
Mm-hmm.
And I ended up buying I had right off the bat, bought like 5 or 10 or 20 books, because that's all there was at that time. Not a lot. There was, the books by Jim and Cora Lorenzen, by Travis Walton, about Betty Andreasen, the Roswell incident, a few books by Frank. There was Frank Scully's book, John Keel, Donald Kehoe, Frank Edwards. These were the real pioneers of UFO research. The Tonga Canyon Contacts by Ann Druffel and D. Scott Rogo. And that was about it. There was not a whole lot of information on this. And when I found out like MUFON existed, that knocked me over. The Mutual UFO Network was the world's largest citizens UFO study group. And I'm looking at the membership, which was a couple of thousand, 5,000. I was shocked. I'm like, wow, there's doctors in here. There's scientists. There are people who are taking this seriously. I called them up, or there was no internet back then. I don't even quite remember how I found out about them. I think it was through a magazine. And I'm like, okay, I'm becoming a member. Send me all your back issues, which went back to, gosh, the 50s, the 60s, maybe the 70s. I'd have to look it up, but pretty sure it was the late 60s. And APRO, Aerial Phenomena Research Organization. And I joined Citizens Against UFO Secrecy, QFOS, the J. Allen Hynek Center for UFO Studies. Oh, that's another guy whose books were out, J. Allen Hynek. So I dived in to the deep end, and I was going to find out if UFOs were real. And it took me about, pretty much right off the bat, as soon as I heard Marco describing this saucer, and then hearing his friends, Phil and Greg, confirm his story, I knew it was real. And I knew what it was. But it's a hard thing to wrap your head around. Grays, taking people on board. No one was talking about abductions. Really, there was, and then lo and behold, I became a field investigator.
And that's how you got really going as a researcher too, right?
Yeah. I found out MUFON. It's like, oh, if you want to investigate, you can become a field investigator. All you have to do is take a test. And they didn't hold classes or anything. Not at that time. They do now. You have to go through a whole process. But I'm like, okay, I'd like to take the test. And they said, all right, it's a take-home test. We'll send it to you. I'm like, take-home? This is going to be breeze. Because the take-home tests are always easier. You can refer to materials, right? It was not a breeze. I will say that. The UFO history part, like what year was Betty and Barney Hill abducted, and where was it? And these sort of questions. The UFO section was a breeze for me. I had recently read everything there was on the subject. But then there was the photography section. I'm like, oof, I'm sorely lacking in my knowledge of photography. And meteorology. Well, I had taken a meteorology course in college, was taking, or I think right at that time, actually. And meteorology is incredibly scientific and very complicated, and far more, difficult than I think a lot of people realize. There's a million different types of clouds and all these ways of measuring humidity. And it is science. And so that was difficult. And astronomy, I was very interested in. So that was a little easier, but all these questions were not nearly as easy as I thought. And there was well over, I don't remember, 100, 200, maybe 300 questions.
Wow.
But I did very well. I missed two. And one I just didn't know. The other I accidentally, filled in the wrong space. I think it was multiple choice, some of them.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I did really well. I became a field investigator and started investigating cases firsthand. And even that wasn't enough for me to really understand what was going on, because it's one thing to talk to someone who's, I've been taken on board, and you're looking at them and you're trying to gauge, are they lying to me? And they're crying sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And they're saying, listen, I don't take drugs. I've got a good job. Please don't use my name.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't even told my wife this. I have no history of mental illness in my family. And they won't even tell you their whole story at first, because they are afraid of being ridiculed and disbelieved. So it was really difficult. I remember finally Whitley Strieber's book comes out, and that went off like an atom bomb in terms of, it went to the top of the New York Times bestseller list. Only one other book at that time had ever done that, which I think was Frank Scully's book, Behind the Flying Saucers, or maybe it was Edwards. I think there's only been 3 books that ever made the list. The Day After Roswell was another one of them, by Colonel Corso. So the subject got a huge wave of publicity right after I had really secured myself into this field as a researcher.
That's interesting in itself, the timing of everything, eh?
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny because, Yvonne Smith and Barbara Lamb and a bunch of other researchers had sort of entered the field at the same time I did. And there was a weird synchronicity to a lot of this, because it was amazing to me how I would be at the post office and someone would bring up the subject of UFOs. I'd be like, whoa, what? Or the bank or the grocery store. I mean, just weird. I don't wear UFO shirts or hats or anything like that. Not that I was the least bit embarrassed about this. I would bring it up absolutely fearlessly, ruthlessly. And because people would be like, UFOs, really? You really believe in that? What's wrong with you? What are you?
People are still like that today, Preston. I don't understand it. I really don't. But there must be a lot of propaganda and a lot of stigmatizing to keep it subdued and keep the information from getting out there. I don't know. But I'm kind of curious. I don't mean to cut you off. Please do finish. But I'm just wondering how you ended up getting to the point where you were researching UFOs at the drive-in, because that's fascinating and shows that maybe they have a bit of a sense of humor somehow. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think there is something to that. I certainly wonder about it, the way they chase cars down the road sometimes and do, show off. They put on displays, and that's absolutely what they're doing. But how it all rolled out was, I'm like, okay, I heard this quote from Llewellyn Hynek. And he said, 1 in 40 people have been abducted. I'm like, what? No.
That's a lot.
Yeah, no, there's just no way. That means I know someone who's been taken on board. And of course I did. That's what really got me to ask everyone I knew. I did not have to ask 40 people. And that's kind of what prompted me to become a researcher. And yeah, the ridicule factor is absolutely our own government's fault. That's our tax dollars at work. Our government put forth a campaign to make all witnesses who have seen UFOs, the only explanation for any UFO sighting is one of 3 explanations. It's either a hoax, it's a hallucination, or it's a misperception. That was the party line. And so I'm like, okay, have you seen a UFO? Have you? And whenever we'd have a new person at work, they would, of course, introduce me. Here's Preston. He believes in UFOs. Have you seen one? And Claudia, Blasios comes to work for our office. And she's one of many people I've interviewed, because there was somewhat of a high turnover back in the day. And this was probably early 1990s when Claudia started working for us. Wonderful lady. And she's like, yeah, I've seen one. And she was super excited to talk to me. I'm like, okay. And I ended, up interviewing her, recording the interview as I always do. I said, okay, Claudia, what did you see? And she says, well, me and my family, my little sister and my parents went to the Paramount Drive-In. I was a little kid. This was 1970, 71, might be 72, but I believe it's 71. And Paramount is here in Southern California. It's a large drive-in, hundreds of parking spots. And she wasn't really paying all that much attention to the movie. She's just a little kid. They're in their Volkswagen Beetle, and she's in the back seat when suddenly she sees people running by the window, dropping their popcorn and their drinks and getting into their cars and screeching off. She thought, wow, that's peculiar. And she, leans to the center of the car to look at the screen. She sees her parents are both dumbfounded, entranced, mouths hanging open and not looking at the movie. They're looking to the right of the screen. And she looks to the right of the screen and there's this flying saucer. And I'm like, what do you mean flying saucer? She says it was a disc. It was silver. I'm like, what silver, like how? She says like a spoon, like chrome, shiny silver. It was beautiful. It had colored lights all around the perimeter and was making this swishing noise, like whoosh, 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 whoosh. And I'm like, wow, she's impressed. And people were screaming. They were running away in panic. And I'm like, wow, how long was it there? She says, it must have been there. I mean, it was there a long time. We were just sitting there staring at it. I'm like, well, what happened next? And she got quiet and a puzzled look came over her face. I'm like, she's like, I don't know. I'm like, what do you mean? She's like, well, I don't remember what happened next. I don't remember it leaving. And in fact, Preston, we kind of forgot about it. I'm like, what?
Yeah, that's interesting.
This is
like, that's thing. Not something you're just going to forget, right?
Generally speaking, no. A UFO sighting is very memorable. It's something people say they think about when they wake up and go to sleep. It's something that's ingrained into their mind. But often, or I would say fairly consistently, perhaps, maybe not often, but a good percentage of the time. I'll have to look into that. How often does this happen? But let's say sometimes. What happens is people don't remember and they don't talk about it and will actually completely forget it. And that's what happened to Claudia. And it wasn't until some years later when she's a teenager and she's in the kitchen with her mom and they're listening to the radio and cooking. And a guy comes on the radio. This was a call-in show. And he says, I saw a UFO. And the radio host says, oh, please tell. And this guy says, well, I was at the Paramount Drive-In in 1971, and this saucer came down and it went to the right of the screen, like colored lights, it was bright silver. And Claudia turns to her mom and says, oh my gosh, do you remember that? We were there, weren't we? Her mom's like, oh, I do remember that. And Claudia says, well, what happened? Why didn't we talk about it? Why didn't we even remember this? And her mom's like, I have no idea. No idea. This is a thing that happens. There's amnesia associated with even simple sightings, but close encounters in terms of being taken on board, yes, amnesia is far more prominent. So now I'm wondering, could this have been a mass abduction? I don't know, but this was my first drive-in movie case, and I thought it was a one-off. I thought, well, this has never happened before. Since I've never heard of this, I got a lot of books on the subject. Don't remember ever reading about this. I would have remembered it.
Mm-hmm.
And I moved on to other cases. I wrote about it in one of my books. And I wrote UFOs over California. And I did find a few more cases. Didn't think much of it. Wrote UFOs over New York. I think there may have been a case or two, but I don't really recall. But I can tell you when I wrote UFOs over Colorado, I came upon this case where these people were at the theater, the drive-in theater at night, and they saw a light off in the distance zigzagging. And it seemed to be fairly random in the way it was moving until it got in view of the theater, at which point it made a beeline for it and hovered right next to the theater. And very, very low level. And not only that, people started flashing their lights and honking their horns. And so this thing flashes back at them. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. I have another case somewhat similar to this. I thought that's really cool. And I continued to do my research. I immediately stumbled upon another case where it came down, hovered right next to the theater, and it was so bright that people could barely look at it and freaked people out. And some of them were driving off. And then I hit a third case in Colorado. I thought, oh no, because I had just written Schoolyard UFO Encounters. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking, there are things that attract UFOs. Certain areas attract UFOs. And I had stumbled upon a number of them. Graveyards, oddly enough, is one of them. Air Force bases, nuclear power stations, prisons, of all things. Rocket launches. These are UFO attractors. And schoolyards, absolutely. I had 100 cases. I thought to myself, oh, what if drive-in theaters fit this category? Because I think they might. And so the first thing I did is started paging through all my books, and I'm like, I'm not finding any. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's just a few, and this was a coincidence. I found one in Ryan Sprague's book. Somewhere in the Skies. Great book. Shout out to Ryan Sprague, because he had an excellent case. I ended up, tracking down the witness that he interviewed, Scott Santa. What a case. Whew. At any rate, I started digging deeper, and I pulled out my magazines, the UFO News Clipping Service, the old MUFON journals. Now, of course, there's the internet. I started digging into the UFO archives of APRO and NICAP and MUFON and NUFORC and all of these. And I started racking up cases fast. And I got a cold chill because I'm like, oh my gosh, here I've been in this field for almost 35 years at this point. And I did not know this. And nobody knows this. This had flown under the radar. How could this be that nobody knows that UFOs are hovering over drive-in theaters and putting on displays? And that's exactly what they are doing. I found over 100 cases all across the United States, some in Canada, scattered outside of the US, but really this is an American phenomena. And found cases stretching all the way back to 1950, coinciding exactly, by the way, with Schoolyard UFO Encounters, all the way up to the present day, with really a huge cluster of cases during the heyday of the drive-in theater, which is 50s, 60s, 70s mostly, and 80s somewhat, and dropping pretty severely after that, but still going on. So this is absolutely a thing. And just real quick, there's some very interesting commonalities to these cases. One is that they are very low level. So we're talking right above the theater, 5 to 10 to 20, 50 feet over the screen, or to the left, or to the right, or right next to the parking lot. Very low level. to long-lasting. A few they dip down, hover, and take off, but most are 5, 10, 20 minutes, or the entire duration of the movie even. So third, they put on a display. It's not just, hey, how do you do? It's flashing their lights. It's doing a little dance. It's releasing smaller craft and putting on a whole full-on show. And fourth is these cases are unlike anything else in the UFO literature in that they are being observed by very large crowds of people. There's nothing like this. Schoolyards is the only thing that's anywhere close. And I thought, well, because the first thing I thought was, what about concerts? Sporting events? So those are both often outdoor events. And I did find a few, but only a few. A few more concerts in terms of sporting events. There was a very famous case in Italy over a huge soccer tournament. But, we have this, Super Bowls, all these regular sporting events, which are almost always outside. And it wasn't happening. It was at drive-in theaters. And oddly, these drive-in theater cases, while often publicized, because that's the only way I could get this information, was that they appeared in newspapers, rarely made it beyond the local news due to the cover-up. But
I was actually going to ask you which of the drive-in UFO sightings was seen by the most people, and I don't know if it's the same question or a different one, but which one got the most media attention, or did any of them get any media attention?
Well, I'll answer the first question first, ironically, the one that had the most witnesses is technically not a drive-in theater. It's an outdoor theater in China. And there was I think it was 3,000 people at an outdoor theater to see, I think it was Beyond the Blue Danube, a movie. And everyone was watching when two large sort of cigar oval-shaped objects swooped down. And they were very bright, fiery orange, and in fact came so low that people could not only hear them sort of swishing, but could feel the heat coming from them. And they swooped down with such speed and without any warning that it caused a panic. And people stampeded. And although these things came down and just did a low-level pass and swooped upwards, people ran in all directions and trampled each other. And some 50 or 100 people were injured, some severely. And in fact, 2 children lost their lives in this accident. It's tragic. So the UFO agenda in these cases is usually just to put on a little display and announce their presence, I think. And I think in this case, they miscalculated the human reaction of fear. That's absolutely the most widely viewed, but generally speaking, it's anywhere from 100 to 400 people. There are some late night shows with only a few people in the theater. But it's hundreds of people on the average. And let's say it's 100, right? Just for statistics, and probably double that, but let's say 100. If you have 100 cases and you times that by 100, 10,000 people.
Wow.
But let's say it's 400, 40,000 people. Okay, now let's remember that 1 in 100 people report their sightings. But let's say it's 1 in 10. That would be 400,000 people. And drive-ins were hugely popular. Huge. It was the #1 American pastime. So why this hasn't become more well-known is beyond me. And in terms of publicity, none of them really got a whole lot of publicity.
Mm-hmm.
They seem to somehow slide under the radar. What would often happen is they would, well, here's one that did get some interesting publicity. There was a case in Canada. I think this was on Prince Edward Island.
Mm-hmm.
If I remember correctly, at the airport airline drive-in, it changed names. The drive-in, but it came down and went off and got some publicity, and then it happened again. It happened a third time, and it continued to happen so many times that the drive-in theater owners put it in their advertisement and said, if you want to see the UFOs, come to the airline drive-in. So yeah, they will target some drive-in theaters repeatedly. That certainly happened to the Yuma drive-in in Yuma, Arizona, which had three sightings that I know of over a period of decades. So yeah, mostly these aren't getting publicity. And there's
no, because they don't want to validate the experience for some reason. They really don't want us even admitting that this has happened to ourselves, or people forget. Maybe partly why they forget is cognitive dissonance, because no one likes to be stigmatized, and boy, the quickest way to have people poke their finger at you and laugh is to say that you've seen a UFO. So, I don't know why they've done this. Do you know why they're trying to keep it secret? Because even today, there's thousands, maybe millions of people who are having experiences, and it's still not getting validated.
Yeah, well, it's changing a little bit. There is some validation there, only because our governments, the deep state, who, people responsible for the cover-up, have to disclose, or they're going to lose all credibility. Because people will not look to them for answers or guidance, and they will lose their control over this subject. So there has been some disclosure, but it's done kicking and screaming and involuntarily, in my opinion. And the cover-up is brutal, and it's been that way from the beginning because of a number of reasons. And we're traveling down an avenue of speculation here. To a certain degree, but it's clear that one reason is that it was covered up from the beginning, and that was a policy that was adopted early on with, pre-Roswell even, and so that was sort of just their MO. That was what they did. It's covered up. This is what we're doing because we don't know what this is. We don't know its capabilities. They did know what it was. So they knew very early on this was aliens. When people are saying, oh, this could be time travelers, this could be interdimensional, this could be a phenomenon, it's wearing different masks. My answer is, do your homework. This is extraterrestrials. And if you just look at the crash retrieval phenomena, the phenomena of onboard experiences, the landing trace cases, the implant removal cases, the fact that the entity cases, come on, it doesn't take a whole lot of logical thinking to realize what this is. This is aliens. This is extraterrestrials. These are beings like us. And I think they're covering it up because they realize what this is, and that if the public knew, well, one thing is they would change their thinking and realize that we are not alone, and that humanity has neighbors, and it would bring us together in a way. And the goal of the secret governments is divisiveness and conflict and war and prejudice. War is not an accident. Remember, we have companies selling weapons to both sides. It's deliberate. So this is real unfortunate. that our own governments or some aspect of them, the military industrial complex, do not have our best interests in mind.
No, they don't.
We have to stop looking to them for answers.
Yeah.
They have not told the truth about UFOs since day one. And it's about greed. It's about money. It's about power. It's about control. That's the bottom line. They have this technology. We have an oil-based economy.
Preston, we're actually running out of time already. I can't believe how fast the time goes. I'm wondering if you don't mind switching gears a little bit, and maybe you could, I'll let you finish, of course, if there's anything else you want to say, absolutely say it. But then I was wondering if we could just touch on your book called Wondrous. And I was wondering if you could share with us what the weirdest ET experience or contact experience was from that book.
Sure. Here, let me just tell one more driving theater encounter very quick,
sure.
Which is at the terrorist drive-in in Bakersfield in 1952. Hundreds of witnesses. One, a military guy, they reported to the local police. He comes over, interviews some 30 witnesses. There was 100 who wanted to give his story. He's like, no, I know what you saw. I will tell the Air Force. He writes a report, sends it off to the Air Force, Edwards Air Force Base, which was the nearest drive-in. This is in Bakersfield, Southern California. And this was the precursor of Project Blue Book. The guy who took the report, which is now declassified and online, you can look at this, marked it action. And it was sent the next day to, get this, the commanding general at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base.
Wow. To
the very top of the UFO study group. And to Enta Air Force Base in Colorado, and to the director of intelligence at Washington, D.C. This is verifiable. Don't believe me. Look it up. Shocking. Our government knew from the beginning about UFOs and knew they were targeting drive-ins, because I have other cases like this where they were right on top of it. I'm like, oh my gosh, we'll call this one a balloon. We'll call this one this or that. None of them made the Blue Book unknown list when they were very clearly unknown, and they knew it. As far as the weirdest one from Wondrous, here's a case I haven't talked about much, but it's so weird, involving two gentlemen in the San Francisco area who were jewelry vendors. They made handmade jewelry and would sell it at Beach Street, which is an open market. And they had this UFO drop down middle of the day, full view of hundreds of witnesses, they thought. And it got real low and they were staring up at it. And it was funny because the guy was thinking before he saw this UFO, don't look up, don't look up, don't look up. It kept entering his mind to the point where it's like, that's weird. And that's when he looked up and saw this thing. And he pointed out to his brother. And this UFO eventually darts away. And he tells his brother, I kept getting this weird thought, don't look up. And his brother looks at him like, oh my gosh. Because I kept getting this thought, checked to make your shoe is not untied. Check to make sure. And he looked at it and it wasn't untied, and he knew it wasn't. And he kept getting that thought. It was like reverse psychology from these UFOs. And so some years go by, and they're at their booth, and he sees this couple approach his booth. He's about 100 yards away, kind of across the way there. And this couple looks a little strange because they're dressed in trench coats, and it's a bright day, and one of them has a hat on, and one's a female and one's a male. They look pretty much normal from where he's standing. And they stop in front of his booth, and he thinks to himself, oh, I hope that they try on some of my jewelry so I can go over there and maybe sell them something. And this woman turns around and looks at him and telepathically talks to him in his head and holds up her hands, hiding them from everyone except for him, like up to her chest, and says, this is why I cannot try on your rings, and holds her hands up in front of her chest with her coat blocking them from view from everyone else. and her hands were not normal human hands. And I'm like, what do
Wow.
you mean they weren't normal human hands? He says, they looked like crow's feet. He says they were black, very skinny, almost claw-like, with huge black talons. And I'm like, you're kidding. He's like, no, I'm telling you, this is what I saw. I saw this very clearly, and she spoke in my head. And they started to walk away. There was another bit of a conversation I'm kind of forgetting, but he said something like, we have to go now, and tell this man not to follow us or there will be trouble. And so she did. She says, don't follow us. And he says, don't worry, I won't. I can't leave my booth because if I do, people might steal my jewelry. And they approached him. You had to kind of approach him to move on out of this outdoor market, and walked right by him about 10 feet away. And she turns and looks at him. And he says, her eyes were not normal. And whenever anyone talks about ETs, it's always the eyes, the eyes, the eyes, right? And I'm like, what do you mean not normal? He says, they were all black. They were not, no whites to her eyes. And otherwise, she was attractive and seemed normal looking. He didn't really get a good look at the guy, but he seemed normal looking. But then again, these guys can also put on a little bit of screen memory, perhaps. But such a strange case. They ended up having another UFO sighting after that. Not sure if all these are related, but that's a case of ETs among us that is so bizarre.
Now, you also have your own show where about a couple times a month or more often than that, you talk about an experience in great detail, one of the ones from your various books and your various research. Do you want to tell the folks a little bit about your show? Because it's super interesting and I really recommend it.
Oh, thanks, Karen. Yeah, I do have my own YouTube channel and I try to put out an episode once a week. I call it UFOs and the Paranormal. But I think if you just punch in my name, that's probably the best way to find it. And yeah, like you said, I put out I love the firsthand cases. And I think that's sorely lacking in our field right now. There's a lot of speculation, and I'm more of just the facts kind of guy. Like, here's a case, you can make up your own mind what's going on here, but this is what these people are reporting. My books are much more detailed because you can only do so much with a 1 hour episode. And I don't like to do much longer than that because, it's a lot of work for one thing. And people, again, don't have the time. But I do have some 2 hour episodes. A lot of stuff on YouTube is very, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. I prefer the long format. Most of my episodes are about an hour. Half hour, an hour and a half to 2 hours. And, yeah, thanks, Karen. I really appreciate it. This subject is so important.
It is.
It's going to change the world. You might not believe in UFOs, but one day you will. I can almost guarantee it.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I want to remind the viewers that the links will be in the description below this, including Preston's YouTube channel and different ways you can get a hold of him and have access. And I've got a complete list of all his books. They're just amazing, amazing content, not just UFOs, also cryptids and other paranormal subjects. And there's just such a wealth of information. And Preston, I want to thank you so much for being on the show. And I just appreciate you so much. And I can't wait to have you on again. And I guess that's it for today. And we'll be seeing everybody next week for the next episode of the Quantum Guide Show.